Hello, this is Brian Mercer for Author Magazine, and today I'm interviewing Rita Rosenkranz from the Rita Rosenkranz Literary Agency. Rita founded her agency in 1990 after a successful career as an editor with such publishers as Random House, Crown, and Scribner. Rita deals exclusively with works of nonfiction in a broad range of subjects. Hello, Rita. It's great to talk with you. First, I wanted to start out by discussing the query process from the agent's perspective. We have a very specific idea of what the process of the agent getting our query letter is like. So it's like the agent has no other job but to look at our query letters, and so they get up in the morning and there's the query letters and they immediately go to them and start paging through them, but that's not accurate. I mean, because you want to find a success. You're looking for the gold in the bunch. So
there's no question about that. It's my authors are my lifeline. Without them, I have no business. So I try to be available, and as you know, some of my conference attending is an expression of that. I do want to be out and about. I want to convey publicly that I'm interested in finding new authors. My list is an ever-growing list, both in terms of categories and relating to the world as it's changing. I am trying to stay current with trends and with moods and with what's popular. So my being out and about is in part to take the pulse of what authors are thinking about, even as I'm in touch with editors regularly to get their point of view as well. Back to the question about how I treat those cover letters and how I see the process. Most of them today come online. If the author has sent simply a query letter and not the proposal, then if I'm interested, I'll obviously ask for the proposal and take it from there. I get perhaps, 100 or so query letters a week. I don't know how that compares with the rest of my colleagues, but I have heard some get almost a truckload every day, and I'm grateful that I actually don't have that deluge, because then I wouldn't be able to pay enough attention to each query. It is wonderful, though, when a query kind of strikes a chord. The fact that the author is well paired to the material, so I right away understand the link between subject and author, making it, in my mind, easier to sell. If the author has a track record, a very public track record that I could sort of use as energy for submitting the work, that also is obviously valuable for me. The business definitely is in a process of changing, in part thanks to ebooks, the consolidation among publishers, the fact that the future is still being defined and hard to predict.
When you say changing, are you saying that it's changing in a good way or just changing and people don't know what to expect?
I think the latter for the moment. While I'm excited about change, knowing that it really is a constant no matter what era in publishing we're in, these changes seem fairly extensive, radical, and will define a new way of doing business. In terms of ebooks, I appreciate that there's another delivery system for authors. Maybe even at best, it helps attract new readers who might have been shy about going into a bricks and mortar store, and for whom this instant gratification delivery system reawakens their interest in reading and maybe inspires them to buy more than they ever had before.
Right. Well, I think even with ebooks, there's going to be, at some point, I would think, there would be a recognition that there's going to need to be some kind of editing process, some kind of way to make that publication readable to the audience, not just to one's friends and relatives.
No question. Well, those books that start out as a hardcover, and that's still the model, have gone through the editing process. And presumably the ebook, for all intents and purposes, is the same text.
So what was your path to becoming an agent?
Well, it was reasonably traditional. I started out as an editorial assistant and climbed the ranks. I started out at Random House, which was a very relatively small company at that time. And what is now considered Little Random in the Bertelsmann empire, you might say, was in fact the Random House I worked at. And it was a swell place. It was full of talent, and we worked with high-profile authors, and it was a great place to be. I moved on to Scribner's and then a division of Crown, and in 1990 decided I wanted to see how the other half lived and became an agent, and started with authors I had worked with previously who were not represented, and built my list from there.
And you represent nonfiction authors almost exclusively. What kind of material are you looking to acquire now?
Well, I think that my taste has remained steady in that I always have looked and continue to look for fresh material that makes an obvious contribution to a marketplace. I look for little-known works or little-known subjects presented commercially, or more well-published works, more well-known subjects presented freshly, so that there's a new twist on the theme, and it's obvious how the market will respond to it.
So as an agent, you're not just accepting clients and turning a person's manuscript over to editors. You're actually doing some work on that to make sure it's the best it can be. Can you talk a little bit about what you do as an agent contribute to the process?
Well, I realize that I'm sending out a package that has to hold up under scrutiny from every angle. So that means editorially, if there are illustrations, they've got to be professional. They've got to really add to the overall work. Since I am a former editor, I do believe I see the material editorially. I do an extensive amount of combing, refining directly with the author, so it takes shape, sometimes several iterations before it actually is ready to be submitted. And I'm obviously grateful when the author has the stamina for that process. My sense is that you don't necessarily have a second chance, and you shouldn't bank on having a second chance by going out with something that is aspiring but that hasn't arrived. Again, figuring you don't necessarily have a second chance. That said, there have been times when I've gotten feedback from an editor once it's gone out, once the material has gone out, and have used that feedback to refine the work even more, and then have gone out to, let's say, new publishers who haven't seen it previously, and have helped connect with a contract because of that feedback from an unrelated editor.
So do you find that when an editor gives feedback, is it ever a case where they'll want to look at it again after changes are made, or is that pretty much just giving you information for down the line?
It's increasingly rare where an editor will say, if you make these changes, I'll take another look. It certainly does happen. But I think that in this sort of quick motion industry where, in fact, editors are being deluged, I used the word before, with material, it's a little bit of next, moving on to the next. And again, that's why I really do believe it's in everyone's interest to take the time behind the scenes to perfect the work before it goes out. I have had situations where I've been able to sell a work after it has been refined based on that particular editor's input, but I don't rely on that happening as a matter of course.
So fairly recently you just came from the Pacific Northwest Writers Association Writers Conference.
Right.
And you were listening to pitches there. And I was curious, as I was in the room with the agents and kind of watching the process, what's going through your mind when someone's pitching a project to you? What are you listening for?
I obviously listen for how the writer is articulating the process. I want to know by the end of those 10 minutes what exactly the book will be, because the author has thought it through. Obviously, on the far end, there are authors who are sort of on a fishing expedition. They haven't put pen to paper yet, and they're sounding out the agent on an idea that hasn't really given birth yet. That's almost an embryo in the scheme of things. And it's not to say I can't rely on it or even respond to it, but it is in less shape than a project, let's say, that is fully formed in the writer's imagination, has been thought through, and maybe even the writer has gone as far as written a sample chapter, if not a whole manuscript in some cases. So there's more to respond to. But more than having material in place is especially when it's a one-on-one at a writer's conference, is the writer's ability to concisely articulate what this work is about so I can wrap my imagination around it and be excited about it. And even better in the case of nonfiction, especially practical nonfiction, is the author's relationship to the subject. If it is, let's say, health-related, it's good to know that the author has the street cred, if not the professional credentials, to carry off that book.
Is it helpful or is it an advantage? I mean, because as a nonfiction agent, you can get, and frequently do, just get a proposal and not a finished manuscript. Do you find that it's helpful for the writer to have actually finished the manuscript, or an advantage to getting an agent?
I am accustomed to selling on the basis of a proposal. In the majority of cases, the author has not completed a manuscript. I will say that it's most helpful for certain subjects where the author has, and it might be a more, I'll say, elusive, obscure subject where the editor might be just a little bit more reassured that the author will be able to pull it off by seeing a full manuscript. But the way the industry works is that in the majority of cases, editors are accustomed to buying on the basis of a proposal, and that's still pretty much true. I
want you to, if you can, give us a very vivid mental picture of what it's like for you to actually, on your routine basis, when you get queries either through email or snail mail or however you get them. What is it? What are you doing? What is it like? Is it in the morning? Is it in the evening? How long does it take? How long do you look at each letter? What's that like? I approach it somewhat informally, so that means I'm not in a business suit. But while I am not compulsive, checking my computer every 3 minutes, I will regularly check in. So I can be, you might say, a first responder. And a part of that strategy is knowing that it is a competitive landscape. There are a whole lot of agents out there. I joke that because my last name begins with R, if an author is approaching the agents directory alphabetically, I'm at a disadvantage. But it is a multitasking kind of day because, as I mentioned, I'm working with the authors. I'm either signed up or hope to sign up if ultimately the proposal is to my liking, and it's not necessarily a formula whether I'll sign them up first or wait to see how far we can take the project before I sign them up. In the latter case, it might be because I'm a little bit borderline and I want to see how wonderful we can make it together before I commit to the project. There's not necessarily one way of doing things. Some of it has to do with, let's say, appointments during the day, or frankly, whether I'm at a writers' conference away from the office, etc. Keeping in mind also that the day has to be dedicated to following up on those submissions I've already made to make sure that I do hear back from editors within an appropriate amount of time. The beauty of the day is that it is multitasking, that it isn't simply in a particular groove that doesn't change from day to day, but really that there is some flexibility. So would you say most of your submissions are by email?
Today, most certainly. And I encourage it because of the fact that it's easy to respond, it's greener, and we can move forward in record time if we're both in gear for it.
So you attend a fair amount of writers' conferences. Do you find them valuable, and do you consider clients who you don't meet at conferences? I mean, is that a disadvantage if you haven't met them face to face, or is it pretty much on equal footing?
As you've said, I do attend a fair amount of conferences. I find them very useful, both personally and professionally. In part because in some cases the conference will introduce me to a new part of the world. And I do believe that as much as I joke it's a global village dressed by the Gap, more or less, we're all the same in very fundamental ways. There are regional differences even now, and I can pick up on those. I can tell whether or not they've done their research on how to find an agent, how to pitch their work. All of that is very useful to see up close and personal. And frankly, I think there still is no substitute for the in-person connection. That said, I find authors in many kinds of ways. I've got a very good track record at the writers' conferences I've attended. including the Pacific Northwest Writers Association. In 2008, I found an author, Cammie Walker, whose book 29 Gifts, How a Month of Living Can Change Your Life, did make the New York Times bestseller list. So, but authors certainly find me through query letters, the traditional regular mail query letter, as well as the electronic version, as well as word of mouth. And on occasion, I will reach out to an author whose work I've read, let's say, in a magazine, what have you, hoping that there might be a book in that author. So I do keep an open mind. It seems to me that if it's a legitimate work, I'll respond positively no matter how that author finds me.
There's this idea that when a writer gets an offer of representation that, you would just say yes. That would kind of an obvious response. But writers should be evaluating the agent. And I was kind of wondering, when a writer's doing that, what kind of things should they be looking for in an agent?
Well, most people will say chemistry is the core connection. You certainly I would imagine, an author would want to know they can have a conversation with their agent, that they don't need to be buddies. In fact, a buddy relationship might get in the way at times, but basically they want a professional working relationship, which has to be built on trust.
Having contact with the industry for a little while, I've seen situations where an author or potential author has a choice between a seasoned agent who might have a name that's been very established and a young, hungry agent. And the kind of intuitive sense is, well, I'll go with the big agent because they've been around, they have the contacts. But what I've found is that sometimes it's actually better to go with a younger agent who's got less of a client base because you're getting more attention. What would you say to that?
Well, I appreciate that question because it does apply to some authors who have multiple interests from various kinds of agents. And I think it's probably a tough decision. And that's when a checklist of questions that you think help identify who you are and what you want from a working relationship. So that means that you want to know what the agent's methodology is, how often you can expect to be in touch. Frankly, even more important is the vision for the work, how they see the work, maybe the publishers they expect to send the work to, so you have a sense of what your possibilities are. So I think that if an author has multiple choices among agents who are maybe ranked differently, those questions and those answers will help define both the comfort level, the chemistry, the journey ahead, and ultimately what those options really are. And I would imagine that not always is the top name agent the best choice. That said, if it's a hungry young agent, you do want to know that there's enough experience there to give you some sense of reassurance. If you're too much of an experiment, I would start to wonder.
So what advice would you give to writers who are trying to break into publishing and are having difficulties in general? When people ask you, what can I do to up my chances of success, what would you tell them?
Well, there might be various stumbling blocks along the way. And sometimes it's as simple as not finding your work properly in the query letter. I can't put enough emphasis on the query letter, which is not to say it's more important than the ultimate proposal. If a great query letter is followed by a bad proposal, obviously you haven't served yourself. The author hasn't served him or herself. But I do see that query letter, which is basically the first connection between author and agent, if it's lackluster, if it doesn't define the work properly, it's going to be the end of the road for the author, and maybe that's what's getting in the way. Maybe the author's timing is wrong. They're getting at the tail end of a trend, whatever that trend might be, and the market is saturated, not hungry for the work, and there's simply not going to be any interest unless something super compelling helps drive that particular project at the tail end of the trend. But so many things that are beyond the author's control will get in the way. And as I said before, sometimes I'm rejecting a perfectly wonderful project because it's not appropriate for me to take on at that particular time. And that rejection should not inhibit the author's search for a good candidate, a good connection to an agent. They should continue to persevere. But I do think that the authors, the rejections that the author gets should be a clue, assuming that they're not all generic, basically just carbon copy rejections that don't reveal any reasons. The author should pay attention to those rejection letters that actually show some insight and maybe use them to retool a letter, to retool the ultimate proposal, to rethink the work, to, in fact, grow the platform. And it's appropriate for me to use this as an opportunity to plug my own book, Get Known Before the Book Deal by Christina Katz, which many authors are now citing when they pitch me as having been useful to increase their own platform to help make their work viable. So not every author will understand what's getting in the way of their progress. I think they've got to be sensitive to the process to understand what the bumps in the road might be, to reflect on those, and to see what they can do to manage the process better. But rejection, being another bump in the road, has to be seen as a gift, especially if those rejections have information the author can learn from.
Sure. So when you say a good query letter, how would you define that? But also, how would you define a bad query letter? What red flags show you this isn't going to go any further?
Well, I think a good query letter is succinct, usually limited to one page. The first paragraph identifying what the work is, and in a way that is understandable and powerful. And the second paragraph being about the author, essentially, that makes clear how the author is tied to the subject, so I can understand the relationship right away and whether the book is saleable based on that author's standing in the large community and making the book promotable. That's basically it. But obviously it's got to be articulate, word I used before. I should understand from it what the author is really pitching. And that leads me to what doesn't work in a bad query letter. I have read query letters, which by the end of it, I'm really not sure what the author is pitching. I read it again to give the author the benefit of the doubt, and I still don't understand. So that's obviously not going to work to the author's advantage. Sometimes something as simple, you might say, as the word count is getting in the way. The author is pitching a memoir that's 240,000 words, where the average memoir is about 80,000, maybe 90,000 words. Unless there are other compelling factors in the query letter, that word count might be enough to put me off. I simply don't want to deal with a work that size for what is not a super compelling memoir in the first place, in a category that's very challenging. And that will be my reason for rejection. So it's sort of knee-jerk, you might say, and based on something seemingly superficial, but it's enough to drive my decision.
Rita, thanks very much for speaking with me today. This has been Brian Mercer for Author Magazine, and today I've been speaking with Rita Rosenkranz for the Rita Rosenkranz Literary Agency.